Hello, and welcome back to the Baby Gang Conversations podcast. In this episode, I spoke with the YouTuber and vocal coach, Sam Johnson. Sam Johnson has built a great following for himself on YouTube with his videos reacting to singers and breaking down vocal science. He also has worked for many years in vocal science, coaching people and instructing people about the ways in which to sing healthily and sing better. I spoke with Sam Johnson about vocal science and in particular about the ways in which people talk about singing online and people talk about certain singers online and their technique. What is technique? What's good technique? What's bad technique? What's airflow? What's all these things? So we talked about some different singers in particular who Sam Johnson has a variety of opinions on as well, including BTS as well as other K-pop groups. So stick around and listen after the intro is done, and it's done now. Bye. I've actually been watching your videos for a while, and I find you to probably be my favorite voice teacher YouTuber on YouTube, honestly. And I've seen many of them, and I think there's a lot of great ones, but I'm especially impressed by just how, professional is kind of a vague word, but you have this incredibly thoughtful and kind of scientific approach, but at the same time you're very skilled at breaking things down in a way that people can understand and being approachable. And there's not a need to overemphasize or be hysterical or histrionic about different things with you.
Yeah.
And so I really appreciate that you're able to do that.
No, I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. Yeah, I try really hard to keep everything analytical and rational, because I think that you need to look at objective things when you're learning how to sing. And ultimately, I look at my channel as trying to teach people how to sing and how to teach and just how to listen to the voice better. So I think that it's important to, keep that in mind as I'm making my videos.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's got their own approach and people will have their preferences, but I honestly think that anybody who's interested in just learning about singing or even just listening to people who are experts or knowledgeable in a field talk about a thing, I think your channel is the kind of channel that should be encouraged and engaged with more. And so basically, I kind of just want to start by asking how you've gotten to this position, where you're from and how you became a voice teacher.
Yeah, so I'm originally from a little suburb out of Salt Lake City, Utah, called Bountiful, and I don't live there anymore. I currently live in Austin, Texas, but I sang quite a bit growing up, but I didn't really start performing a lot until high school. In junior high, I started taking some guitar lessons, and my teacher would put together these little groups that we'd go in, these bands, I guess, and we'd perform 2 or 3 songs at a showcase, and no one wanted to sing, so I was kind of shoveled into singing for every single group, and that gave me a lot of my first experience on stage and singing and everything. And so I always thought I was a pretty good singer, but then in high school I started taking some voice lessons to prepare for a role. So I was cast in Les Miserables as Jean Valjean in high school, and I didn't know how to sing. I could sing pretty well, but that is a role that you have to actually know how to sing to sing. So I was taking these lessons, and we were mostly just trying to get me through the role, and a lot of the things that we worked on, they weren't the ideal way of doing things in the long term, but we got me through, and I performed that. And my teacher, as she was working with me, she thought that I would become a teacher for some reason. I guess she saw that I was just an analytical, kind of thoughtful person. And so she started explaining a lot of why she would do certain things. And that's kind of my first start into everything.
Yeah. And so how did you end up really pursuing it as a career and then eventually pivoting to making YouTube content?
Yeah. So out of high school, I went and studied voice a little bit at a college, and I wasn't really ready at that point. So I went back and forth between community colleges and between what I actually wanted to do. And there was a time I wanted to be a lawyer for a while, and there was a time that I wanted to go into medicine, and all that time I was still taking private lessons because I wanted to be really good, and I thought that I was really good. but I was learning how to teach from these great teachers and taking from a lot of really great teachers. And I started teaching a little bit on my own because it was, a skill that I wanted to get better at, but I could actually make some money, and it was easier than just going and getting a real job. And so I just learned through experience with that. And I was helping people, and it felt really good. And ultimately, that's always been my goal, is just to help people. And so all of those other careers that I was going down, it's like I wanted to be an English teacher for a minute because I wanted to help people and I like books, and I wanted to go be a doctor because I wanted to help people, and I wanted to be a lawyer because I wanted money. But like, it was still just the analytical side of all of that. All of those things kind of feed into what I think it takes to be a really good voice teacher. Yeah, so I just kind of was doing all of those things, learning a little bit of everything. And then one of my voice teachers got a job application or a job notice from a studio in Hong Kong. And I had never been to Hong Kong, but I was wanting something different in my life. And so I applied for it. Wow. And I ended up getting a job there. So I went over and taught full time for a year and a half. And that was the first time that I was able to not really worry about finding students or about the money aspect of anything. And I was able to just focus on teaching. And I just loved it. I loved it, loved it, loved it. So when I came home, I was still thinking I was going to try to go to law school and stuff. But I ended up finishing my degree in vocal performance. And then after I finished that degree, I was teaching all the way through that, but my girlfriend wanted to go to school in Phoenix, so we moved down to Arizona together, and I was desperate for students, so I started making YouTube videos, and they just really took off.
What's teaching in Hong Kong like? Like, I want to know kind of what the clientele you were teaching, what they were like and what they were looking for, and like how that informed your experience of being a voice teacher and communicating with different types of people.
Yeah, good question. So the studio that I worked at in Hong Kong, it's called CSMA Studio, Christine Sampson Music and Art Studio. And Christine and her daughter Crystal, who was my boss, they work with most of the Cantonese pop people. And so she's like very, very well known in that scene, and they were running out of spots, and they wanted to still be able to serve people who wanted to learn the same sort of style that was taught to these like really famous people over there. And so me and another teacher were kind of brought on to handle that overflow clientele. So it was mostly amateurs, but I did get a chance to work with a few of those performing artists, and that was really fun. Just being around them and seeing, they were normal people. But most of my clientele was honestly women in their 20s and 30s. And then I also had quite a few guys who were businessmen and just needed to learn how to sing a karaoke song. Because over in Hong Kong, it's like a big thing in business to be able to just go out for karaoke, and no one wanted to embarrass themselves. Yeah, so that's mostly who I was working with. But there were also quite a few people who, they wanted to learn how to sing, but they also wanted to get better at English. And I think that it was a really good pairing, actually, because so much of the singing work that I do works on articulation and on how to form different sounds. And if they were singing songs in English, it was a really good excuse for them to work on how to articulate for English. And so that worked really well. And it also gave me a chance to work with a lot of people who wanted to sing other styles of music. Like, they were singing a lot of Cantonese pop and Mandarin pop and K-pop and Japanese pop. And it was super fun to not be focusing so much on how to say the words, but just the stuff that all of these different genres have in common, and on singing in different languages, what they all have in common.
Right. When it comes to vocals in Cantopop or K-pop or J-pop, what like what's the sort of, is there an approach difference that was particularly notable for you, where it was like, oh, okay, this is more what they're looking for in terms of how they want their voice to sound?
Um, I mean, there's some very obvious stylisms where they're ultimately no, but there are those stylistic things like they all kind of utilize breathier sounds, especially earlier in the song. And then they get to that big belty part, and then there's usually a key change, and it's a very strong key change. But ultimately, like the way that you use your voice for any style, I think is fairly similar.
Right. So this kind of gets to the heart of sort of what I was interested in when it came to speaking to you. When it comes to music discourse online, and especially in terms of K-pop discourse and other vocalization discourse, like when it comes to vocal heavy music or vocal heavy performance, there's often, we'll say that there's a lot of people with a lot of opinions.
Yeah.
And mostly there's a kind of adherence to this idea that there's a way to sing, and that there's an objective way that you project, that you support. Support is a very often used word, and overall.
And what does support mean? Like, I know you don't have a ton of experience with all this stuff, but you're embedded in the culture. So I'm really curious to know what people think support even means.
Generally, it's not too dissimilar from what people kind of describe support as in any sort of casual singing conversation, in terms of like, oh, like, well, that note sounds a bit rounder, it doesn't sound, and it sounds very clear, and it's usually what you're talking about, like belting high notes. And so people will compare a high note in a song that is belted by this one singer and say, listen to the vibrato, it sounds natural, it doesn't sound like they're straining, which is a whole other discourse in and of itself. And these kinds of things will lead a person to say, this is a very vocally supported note, and then this other singer may not have the same vibrato sound, or may sound like they're straining or raspy or whatever the case might be, and then that will be an example of a not supported note. That's the general gist of what people
exactly
talk about.
And that's I think that's the problem, is that people use these terms and there's not a very specific thing that they're talking about with it. Because support for me was a word that took a really long time to kind of understand, and at this point I just look at it as support is if you have a healthy amount of pressure as you're singing,
right,
but not too much pressure, and that usually that results, or that happens because you are breathing in deep enough, or like you're at least releasing your abdominals when you're breathing in deep, and you're keeping them kind of pushed out as you're singing out. But I think that a big problem with all of this discourse is people will hear these terms and they'll just throw them at everything indiscriminately. And it's like people don't know exactly what they mean, and they mean different things for different teachers. And so the solution for a lot of that is to use the scientific terminology, because that's a little bit more standardized. But then people just start dwelling so much on, the scientific stuff, and you lose the artistry. It's a really tricky industry, honestly.
Yeah, it's incredibly tricky to define what's a good singer and what's a bad singer. And a lot of times it's a kind of, it when you hear it thing, where it's like,
exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
like, this singer is a great singer. Like, oftentimes even people will cite examples of someone like Christina Aguilera, or even someone like Whitney Houston, and be like, well, obviously these are great singers, but not realize the sort of irony of like how a lot of people criticize those singers for how they use their technique, and that being potentially unhealthy. When you were making your YouTube channel and sort of starting out and pointing out these things and singing, were there particular things that you noticed about the landscape, or about what YouTube discourse was like in terms of these things, that you thought, okay, well, this is something that I kind of want to correct, or I want to kind of add my own experience and knowledge about this here?
Yeah, so I mean, when I was first starting, there was only There was Tristan, and I didn't really think anyone else was putting stuff up, or I didn't see it. And I was
Right.
actually watching Tristan's videos, and I think Tristan's a really talented dude, and he's an amazing entertainer. There's a reason that he's been as successful as he has been. But as I was watching those videos, I felt like there wasn't as much focus on how to apply things on your own and on what's going on. And I just thought that I could be an additional voice in the community. Because I think that like Tristan really is quite a good teacher. But he's not Sam, you know? And
Right.
I find a lot of people will compare all of us. They'll compare me and Tristan and Rebecca and what's her name and Georgina and, you know, everyone, and argue about which of us is best. But, you know, that's not what this is about. Ultimately, we just want y'all to be better singers.
Right.
Or to be entertained for half an hour. And it's like, most of us are, I don't really talk to many of them. But like the times I've talked to Tristan and Georgina, like we're all cool with each other. We're just tired of people pitting us against each other, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's fascinating because I remember when Tristan was starting, from what I was able to pull back in the day, was there was a lot of sort of science, like vocal science myths, or like kind of some almost like snake oil salesman type of
Sure. No, 100%.
YouTubers that he would take aim at, and he would make a video about
Yeah.
like, oh my god, this vocal teacher has been completely teaching people wrong about this and that.
Yeah, he was really confrontational, and yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that. He was very confrontational.
Yeah. Whereas now it doesn't seem like there's as much confrontation among the vocal teachers, especially since you all sort of have your own thing, and there's a bit more of an open attitude in terms of like how people talk about voice and talk about singing. But there are still these very stringent ideas within, you know, sort of a conversational, like layman way, wherein people will, you know, average people will talk about the voice being in this objective thing, like, oh, this is objectively a better singer than this other singer.
Right.
And
right.
this is something that we sort of see in the K-pop community a lot, and we see it in other communities as well. I kind of want to talk to you about some of the artists that you have looked at on YouTube, on your channel.
That's tough. But for a second, I do want to get back to just what you said about objectivity versus subjectivity in singing, because I think
Right.
it's a really important distinction. And just flat out, it's okay to like things. Like,
Right.
it is 100% fine to like something. It's also fine for me to go in and be like, this thing that you like, it's fine for you to like it. I don't think it's sustainable for this reason, this reason, this reason. I
Right.
also like it. There are other times that I don't like it, and I'll still just try to say, here is what they're doing, and try to break it into the objectives. Break it into how much airflow do you hear? How much pressure do you hear? What are they doing with their vowels? What can we see? What can we hear? What are these choices that they're making that make them subjectively awesome? And what are the things that they're doing that will make them objectively lose their voice if they do it too many times? And when I'm training people, I think that that's my biggest goal, is trying to get people to focus on objective changes that they can make, changing how much airflow they're giving, something that you can like measure, changing objectively what they're doing with their tongue, what they're doing with their lips, and then see how the subjectivity kind of follows with it. Because usually if people are singing in a really well-balanced way that feels really good for them, then other people are going to like it.
Right.
But ultimately, like, people don't care. People really don't care. They care if they're being moved and if things are vaguely on pitch. But as long as the singer is like communicating what they're wanting to do, most audiences will look past it. So I think it's really silly how often people try to pit these singers against each other as like, no, this one has way better vocal technique, as if it matters, because it just ultimately doesn't matter.
Right. The only place in which it would matter is, as you said, in terms of vocal health and being able to have a sustainable career in voice moving forward.
And in their ability to be able to communicate how they're feeling. And if their technique isn't serving that, then it's serving nothing. But technique has that purpose alone. And I think that a lot of people start trying to rank it, but that's just not the point of singing at all, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very refreshing perspective. The way that I want to talk about these artists is I kind of want to talk about some ideas or consensus ideas about these artists and their style of singing, and
Sure.
how you feel about that, and also how you feel just in general about the merits and the strong points of what their technique allows them to do, right?
Yeah.
The first artist I kind of want to talk about is actually Billie Eilish.
Yeah.
Billie Eilish just put out a record that was actually super, fascinating, and the chord structure and everything was really kind of unusual even for her. But she's still kept up this characteristic of being a singer with a softer voice, a singer with who projects a lot of emotion and a lot of almost sort of a quiet emotional storm in the way that she sings. It's fascinating, and there's not very many singers who are like her, despite her being so influential. And I want to talk about, for you, like, sometimes people talk about her style of singing as being like lesser because she doesn't have any belt range, or she doesn't have any like power in her voice, or sometimes that she's like sort of a one-trick pony kind of thing. And I want to talk to you about like what you think about that consensus or that idea that sometimes people spread, and what she does that you find impressive.
I think that she connects to the song. She knows what she's singing about. She knows who she's singing to. She knows how to make people feel. And the technique serves that. So when I listen to Billie sing, I hear a lot of potential to be able to make other sounds that she doesn't choose to use. And I think that she will probably use some of those sounds as her career matures. But she's 18 years old. Man, like, the sounds I was making when I was 18 versus now are totally different in a lot of ways. And just me as a person at 18 versus me at 29, totally different person. So I think that it's like really fair to look at her and say, this is an accurate depiction of Billie at 18. Right. And people are reacting extremely well to it because the songs are catchy, they're well produced, and she has a very strong character that she sticks to. And that's, I think, all that people, like the average listener, really cares about. Then we look at, like, well, she's not belting, so that means she's not a good singer. Obviously not, because the whole point of singing is to be able to communicate what you're trying to do. Is she limited in the kind of music she's releasing? Absolutely. But it's also like some of the most successful pop music that we've seen since Adele. And I think that we have to remember that as people who care about the voice and about how it's being used, we have to remember ultimately what the goal is, and that's to make people connect to you at a heightened emotional state. We're trying to communicate at a heightened stakes. And that's it. And I think she does that really well. But then we look at like her singing No Time to Die, and where she actually gives it a little bit more pressure. She gives a little closer to a belt. And I think she did it quite well. I would love to work with Billie Eilish. Honestly, like, that would be a dream, just to help her feel like she has as many tools in her toolbox to express herself, because I don't think that she is limited to the kind of music that she's doing emotionally. I think that there's more to Billie that she just hasn't let out yet. And I just would love to be part of her finding those tools to explore different parts of her emotionally. But yeah, I don't think she's a one-trick pony. I think that she knows what her audience wants right now, and she knows the story that she's trying to tell, and she just doesn't get outside of that lane right now.
Right. And, sort of off topic, but still kind of related to all this conversation, is this, when it comes to these ideas of like an objective vocal technique, like obviously there's a lot of it that's pretty messy. Like it's just people's opinions couched as like, nah, this is actually objectively better. But there's also, to a degree, there's of course things when it comes to vocal technique that are needed and are important, like airflow, and just in terms of pitch generally. Like if you don't sing the notes, then it basically doesn't matter
Right.
what you're singing. But when it comes to this level of singer, pretty much all of them are going to have these basic vocal techniques and ideas down pat, and everything from there is just a matter of subjective opinion and what they want to do with their sound.
For sure, yeah. I mean, if you're good enough at getting your ideas across to other people in the way that most of these high-level singers are, like, you've just done it enough that you'll figure some stuff out with your voice. And I think a lot of people who might start their careers out, with more poor technique, just with the sheer repetitions that they do as their career progresses, they get better at certain things, even if they're not like actively focusing on them. But it also kind of points to the idea that vocal technique work, it's a quicker path, but ultimately all of your vocal technique needs to be motivated by something more human. And by tapping into those human elements, these people who might not have traditional training are still able to get fairly similar sounds. So I don't think that everyone at that level has like the most balanced voice ever. I think there are a lot of these high level singers that have significant things that I would love to work with. But ultimately remembering singing as three things, I think simplifies it a lot for me as a teacher and for me as a listener. It's airflow, moving past some little muscles, and then forming into a word. And so all of my analysis kind of comes down to one of those three things. Is there something funky with the airflow, something funky with those muscles vibrating in your throat, or is there something funky with the vowel?
Right. Another singer that sort of sparks some interesting conversation about style of vocal and whether or not it's healthy is Louis Capaldi, mainly because the song "Someone You Loved" is a song that exhibits a lot of like sort of growled and raspy vocals, and aside from it being a taste matter where some people don't want to hear vocals that sound like that, or especially on a song like that, or whatever the case might be. I was curious if you could talk sort of about how much Louis Capaldi's technique you feel works for him, and how much of it you feel there might be some concern about durability or about vocal health.
Yeah, he's not like growling so often that I think it's just going to wreck him, even if he was using it in an inefficient way. But when I hear him do it, it doesn't sound like it's wrecking him. And a lot of this kind of does come down to I feel what they're feeling kind of as they're doing it. And it just doesn't feel that bad when I listen to him singing, where with some people when they're singing in a really heavy way, it just feels bad. And you can kind of tell. I think that he sings with a little bit more pressure than I would recommend, but it works pretty well for him. And like in that song, he has on the I tend to close my eyes when it hurts, it goes up to a B flat, which is high enough that it gets into this area that if you're just pulling chest voice and pressing and squeezing, it's going to be really difficult to get up there. And I don't know. I think that just what he's done so far shows that it's not the worst technique ever, but then I hear his vibrato and I'm like, that sounds imposed in some way, or it doesn't sound like a vibrato of a really smooth, totally efficient technique.
Right.
So I think there's enough going well with him that I'm not worried that he's going to blow out his voice if he went and toured, but he's definitely on the edge of that, where it's like the same kind of thing that I was thinking with Adele years ago, where I'm like, this voice is awesome and it's so powerful, but it doesn't sound sustainable. And then she blew out her voice, and then she changed it. Like, she changed how she was using her voice, and now she uses it in a much more efficient way. But, there's precedent of these people kind of wrecking their voice in certain ways. Frank Ocean blew out something a few years ago, and like, it's not uncommon at all.
Right. I mean, Adele was actually another artist that I was interested in talking to you about because of that idea of the way in which she changed her voice or the way in which she adjusted her technique to support
Yeah.
to support her health. And the way in which that happened, it almost doesn't seem like you can notice it from record to record, because she
Yeah.
still basically sounds the same. She sounds as good as ever.
And she's expressing herself as authentically as she ever did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, for sure. So yeah, I kind of want to ask you just about what those techniques might have been, or what those things that those things were that she might have done in order to get herself in a better place health wise with her voice.
Yeah. So looking at like the album 21, there's a lot of when she goes to her high notes, it sounds like she's just opening her mouth really wide and pushing a lot of air. And it's basically a well-controlled yell for a lot of those things, which again, I'm saying as a compliment for her that she was able to use that technique in order to tell stories that people just ate up. I don't think it's sustainable though, and I think that it was proven that it wasn't. So from what I've heard since, and I haven't really looked at a lot of videos of her doing it, it sounds like she's narrowed her vowels a little bit, which kind of gets us out of that yell reflex. And it sounds like she's played around with some nasality just to find a thinner feeling. So as we're going toward higher pitches, the vocal folds, which are just these muscles in your larynx, which is in your throat, they have to stretch and thin out. If you increase the pressure underneath as that's happening, as she kind of did in her earlier career, it just gets really difficult to repeat. It's kind of like if you're clapping your hands really, really hard, it starts hurting, versus if you're just letting them kind of roll together, it doesn't hurt as much.
Right.
And so it's that strong clapping that she was doing that I think left her susceptible to injury. And then she had that vocal hemorrhage because they were just, so stressed out. So it sounds like she's reduced that pressure. I hear a little bit of, it just feels like it's moving into her head more. And I'm scared to use terms like nasal resonance because I don't think they mean very much, but it just feels like it moves into her head a little bit more, and it doesn't have as much pressure, and there's more volume control. Right. And all of those things point to it just being like better, more sustainable technique.
Right. The fascinating thing about these conversations is that I've spoken to people, people who are even a lot older than me, people who are younger than me, who, have felt like, oh, I'm not a good singer, and, I've always wanted to be good at singing, but I've never really gotten better, or I never really know how to sing. And I've told them, like, I mean, there's countless examples of people who you literally just work on it. You whether you get a coach or even by yourself, and you can make some incredible improvements. And most of these singers that you see at this high level are people who had to get a lot better over time in order to get there. Another example of somebody who probably was never a bad singer, but received some criticism early in her career as far as her vocal technique and being a good singer or not a good singer. She has been able to become so much better as a vocalist to where she's now constantly acclaimed for it. And that person's Beyonce. Beyonce is a person who now is kind of revered as one of the better voices in pop music, among other things. And one of the most impressive things about her is, aside from her belt range and aside from her dexterity in terms of like the melisma that she'll do, Beyonce has been able to cover so many different genres of music to the point she's had forays into country and into Afro beats and into regular standard American pop and into ballads, and so I was wondering if you could kind of talk about some of the things that Beyonce does with her voice that have made her such a outstanding vocalist.
Yeah, I think Beyonce is like one of the best vocalists in pop music right now. She's like a generational talent, and I love Beyonce. I don't know. I think she's always been really good, and she's just gotten way better. But she's had training forever.
Yeah,
hasn't she? Like, wasn't it from childhood?
Yeah, I mean, she was training since very young. Yeah.
Yeah. So she built some really good habits young. Some of the things that I think make her stand out are her ability um, to go through a bunch of different dynamics on a single pitch. So there's a exercise in classical Italian technique. It's called messa di voce. It means like movement of the voice, I think. But it's starting on a pitch and then singing it really quietly and then crescendoing and then diminuendoing all on the same pitch. So it kind of sounds like this.
Right.
And it's really freaking hard to do. And a lot of these singers who are just like pulling chest voice up and singing with way too much pressure or like doing that more controlled yell, they won't be able to do that. Being able to do that implies, a higher level of skill. It's the kind of stuff that I try to teach. And she sounds like she has that skill on every freaking note in her range. Every single one. She is so well balanced. That alone just makes me feel like she's way better than most of the other pop vocalists out there in terms of her vocal technique. And I think that that's what lets her sing in so many different genres. It lets her go to that Ave Maria place. It lets her go to the really belty stuff. It lets her sing Love on Top and go to the highest notes, and have it stay in a fully connected voice. And some of it is just like genetically she is a very gifted singer. But most of that stuff is like how she's using her instrument. It's not just what she was born with.
Right. Which is a lot of people. I mean, there's discourse about like being tone deaf, quote unquote, and being like, oh, I can't sing, I can't even hear pitch, from being a young person. But even people that I've known who have had issues with hearing pitch have trained themselves into be very good singers.
I think most people are not tone deaf. Most people have a really difficult time recreating the sounds that they're able to hear in their head, and when they're unable to do that, they give up. But I look at it like, if I was handed a violin, I would have no idea what to do with that violin. It would take me a little while to learn how to actually create the sounds that I'm hearing on that violin. And I think it's the same thing on the voice, and people just don't give themselves enough credit.
Right. Man, this is so much fun. There's a lot of singers that I want to talk about, but we're since we're closing in on that hour, I've only got a few left on the main list. Another person who sparks a lot of fascinating conversations about what makes a great singer, and had a lot of criticism in the past years about whether or not her technique was as good or whether it was getting worse over time, is Ariana Grande.
I thought you were going to say Mariah.
Mariah is a whole other conversation too. Ariana is fascinating because she's been singing all her life and started in musical theater, and has progressed into doing these different genres of music, and has been acclaimed and talked about a lot for her ability to do whistle register notes that she hasn't done as much anymore, and her belting. I kind of want to know like what goes behind that. What's behind that conversation about like whether or not she's getting worse or better, and like whether or not you think that there's any credence to it, because she still seems to be a quite spectacular singer these days.
Yeah, I think she's incredibly talented as a vocalist. I think that it's just the kind of music that she's making. Like, there's been this... You don't hear as much melody in her singing, and I think that, like, at least in the last few albums compared to her first two, and I'm a huge Ariana fan. Like, those first two records... whatever they were called, I can't even remember. It
was a Dangerous Woman record, and
yeah, was it that one? Anyway, like the first two, the one that had BBY and the one that was right after that, I think they're just like beautiful melodies and really freaking hard melodies for a lot of them. They're difficult to sing, and I actually still will send a lot of my students to sing along with songs from that first record just because they are in an area of the voice that you have to sing fairly balanced in order to sing it well. It's really difficult to just pull chest voice up for it. Yeah, it's just trap, man. It's taking over everything.
Yeah.
And I like a lot of trap music, but it's really made it a different thing that I think record labels are looking for. And I haven't listened to as much of her more recent stuff just because I don't think it's as memorable. But I think she's still like unbelievably talented.
Right. She's incredibly talented, and it's a part of it also makes me wonder about like how much of it is preservation, like how much of it is like, you know, okay, well, I was singing all these incredibly difficult songs in every show, touring across the nation, night after night, performing, and perhaps I would like to do some songs that are a little bit less demanding, or perhaps I would like to do some songs with different dynamics. Yeah.
Maybe it's a little bit of that, but like when you're singing as well as she is, it's not hard.
Right.
It takes a lot of energy, sure, but it's not like physically just going to destroy you. You look at the highest level singers, like high level opera singers who have to sing very demanding stuff for 3-hour performances, and they'll only do like 2 or 3 performances a week because it's so vocally demanding. You might be able to look at some of her stuff like that, but like at that point, she's got a microphone. She's not singing loud. She's not singing with high pressures. She's the stuff that she's doing when she's singing well on those first few records. It's not that hard for her to do. So I think that's kind of a cop out, honestly. Like, I think that it's just bigger forces that are dictating the market and dictating what kind of music people are writing.
Right. Right, yeah, and I'm sure that she has part of it is her personal taste too, in terms of like, I just want to do this kind of music. The preservation conversation kind of leads into the Mariah conversation that we kind of hinted at, because people have spoken about. I mean, it's clear that her newer records are a bit lower in her range, and that she's got a different approach, sort of, in terms of how she performs vocally. And this is a tricky conversation, but I don't think anybody would ever say that Mariah has become a bad singer now. I'm wondering though.
And again, I think that we need to just keep qualifying that of what is a good singer. A good singer is someone who communicates effectively. Mariah has always been a good singer that communicates effectively. Sometimes her technique has failed her.
Right.
But yeah, sorry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sometimes her technique has failed her, as is common with pretty much every performer at some point. I'm wondering if you could just sort of talk about what are some things that she's doing with her voice now, and what as opposed to what she used to do with her voice, that may or may not be healthier, or why she was much more I guess aggressive in terms of pursuing more vocally demanding work back in the day, like how she was approaching that vocally demanding, higher range whistle tone type of songs, as opposed to
I mean, honestly, Elliot, I don't think she's changed much over the years, and I think that's the problem, is that when she was younger, okay, as soon as I start these conversations, like Mariah stans just jump on me, and they're like, no, she's had vocal nodes since she was a kid. And then I'm like, yeah, that's the whole freaking point, is that when she was a child, she was using her instrument in a way that was unsustainable and that was injurious. And that didn't really change much. Like the really heavy use of her voice, singing really loud in a way that I don't think Ariana has ever done. High singers, high tenors, and high sopranos are more at risk for vocal injury than any other vocal type, just because of physics. So when you're singing this note, your vocal folds come together 440 times a second. If you go down an octave, that's halved, so it's 220 times a second. If you go up, it's 880. If you go up even further, it's 1600 times a second. That sometimes when she's singing those whistle notes, her vocal folds are coming together that often. That creates a lot of friction, and it's just like physically a lot harder to sing the higher that you go. Especially if you sing with as much loudness and weight as she does and did. And then also you hear just how she is approaching some of those notes is so pressured, where I think that she actually sang the high stuff way healthier than she sang the lower stuff. And if you could just like change the approach up to those high things, I think that she would have a more consistent career, because I think that it's irresponsible to say that she doesn't make bangers. She has so many freaking awesome songs, and she's been great for years, right? But you look at it and she's had so many times that her voice has just failed her. On that New Year's Eve performance, on there are countless performances that her voice has just failed her. That's straight up technique. And I think that it's, at this point, it's been proved that she doesn't want to change how she's singing it, because she does. I think it's probably because she doesn't want someone like me to try to like change that core spark. But I think that that's a false argument, because nothing that I do will ever change someone's ability to be themselves. And people like Mariah because she's Mariah. They don't like her because of the notes. I think that they might convince themselves that they like it because she sounds really good on this part and this part or whatever. But it's because she's her and she's expressing herself authentically. And so even if we were to change the way that she used her voice slightly, just to take the edge off so that she doesn't injure herself anymore, and that it actually becomes a healing experience rather than a strenuous one, like, she's still going to be Mariah under all of that.
Right. Give me 1 second. I have to close the door. All right, I'm back. Yeah, the Mariah conversation is fascinating because she's undoubtedly, she's probably the most successful female artist of her generation. I mean, yeah. The amount of hits, the amount of presence, she's undeniable as a force. But another example of how complicated singing can be, because so much of it is psychological. And so much of it is just like approach, and some singers would like to just keep singing the way that they want to sing, if it kills them or not. But
exactly. And I also think that, her being an 18-year-old singing the way that she did, she might be able to get away with it a little bit different, versus as she ages and has children and her body physically changes. If you approach it with the exact same way without making small adjustments throughout life, it's not going to work well. It's going to be bad most of the time.
Right. Regardless, as we said, she's a great singer.
She's fantastic.
She's always been. I mean,
and like, look at her catalog. It's like you said, the word is undeniable. And I think that a lot of people just come expecting people like me with some perceived authority to be like, she's the best singer. She's so good. She's talented. She's the way that she sings is going to work forever. And it's like, no, as a grown person, you can hold multiple ideas. You can admit that she's freaking awesome. And you can also say, this is probably not how I'd want to teach my students.
Right. It's just an example of something to deconstruct, and at points it might feel like it's nitpicking, but at the end of the day, these things are very important.
For sure.
And they vary from person to person. And some people kind of figure out a way to make technique that doesn't seem very healthy work for them forever, because everybody's body is different. I kind of want to pivot now as we head into the last sort of 10 minutes of the conversation to talk about some K-pop artists. Of course, K-pop stans are probably the most intimidating in terms of online discourse. For a lot of people will talk to me who aren't familiar with the space and be like, "Oh my God, I'm so scared," But there's the idea that K-pop stans are like monolithic is quite over exaggerated. People will generalize and not realize that a lot of K-pop stans are interested in genuine analysis and conversation and do care about music. Just if you the thing about it is, a lot of fans, if you come off a certain way that seems disrespectful, they won't like it. And regardless, I think that the focus I want to be, where I want to focus my energy is more of a positive place, because undoubtedly the K-pop industry, the idol industry, is filled with ridiculous talent. And whenever it comes to talking about the ways in which these different artists sing, there's often not so much to critique, because they're all such good singers, most of the time, that they are able to do their own thing and sing in different ways, and as you said, it conveys their message and their authentic self, or what the song demands of them quite well. But we can just talk about a couple of artists today that are quite popular. The first artist that I kind of want to talk to you about is Blackpink, and particularly Rosé from Blackpink. You did cover. You reacted to one of her performances about a year ago. A song
Yeah,
called
yeah.
"If It Is You." Rosé is a singer who has gotten a ton of criticism. I mean, a lot of people can be quite harsh in these realms about who has good technique, who has bad technique, who's a good singer, who's a bad singer. And aside from a lot of it kind of being in bad faith because people have their allegiances, a lot of times it seems quite harsh or ascientific. In terms of Rosé, I want to know like how you feel about what her general singing technique from what you've seen, and like what the merits of her singing are, and like why she might sing in the way that she does, because it is quite unusual within the space that she works in.
Man, I haven't listened to her for a long time. I don't know her voice well enough to talk in any real authoritative way, but I
Right.
just remember that I liked what she was doing and it sounded pretty easy. And what are some of the things, like, just flipping this back to you, what are some of the things that she gets critiqued on by people in the club?
People will sometimes say that she's pitchy, I guess. People will
Is
sometimes.
she?
I mean, everybody has off performances, but I don't necessarily think that that's a fair characterization.
Yeah.
Um,
So I do think that, like, a lot of times pitchiness, it's a bad indicator because, like, so many of these people, they've got incredible ears. And so pitchy is like, it's not useful in any way in
right.
terms of what I do, which is trying to help balance voices. It's like, it's just an example of, okay, we're consistently pitchy. That's going to be a problem. Why? What are they doing that is unbalanced in some way leading to that pitchiness? And so I guess if you see like enough performances where someone is noticeably pitchy for the majority of people that they're noticing, they're like, oh wow, that's something's a little bit weird, then something might be a little bit weird at that point. But is that kind of what's happened with her?
I think people just genuinely have somewhat polarized opinions about the way in which she sings, because her enunciation can often be a little bit different. A lot of people compare her voice to kind of like Avril Lavigne, so she has kind of this like almost pop punky way of like
Yeah.
enunciating and like rolling into her notes and stuff like that. That is a little bit unusual, and sometimes people will feel like, oh, that's not good singing.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people just see something that's different, especially in a a scene that is fairly homogenous, and they don't like it.
Right.
That's kind of what my instinct would be on the case, is just if she sings in a way that's different enough from what all of the other stars are doing, then people will feel threatened in some way, or I don't know. I think it's just an unfair expectation.
Right. Right. Um, Another artist that I want to talk to you about that you have covered a lot more within K-pop is EXO. EXO are a
Yeah.
group that have long been renowned for having a great vocal line.
Yeah, I like EXO.
That's kind of what they call it in K-pop, is a vocal line, because they have a select group of people who are vocalists, but then the whole group will
Mhm.
sing, but some will specialize. Regardless, EXO is often complimented and put like at the top of lists in terms of K-pop discourse. And for you, as somebody who's observed many of their videos and paid them a lot of compliments, what are some of the things that you see with EXO that make them so effective and probably make people so, you know, praising of them?
They're really consistent. I think that's probably the biggest thing, and that's one of the things that I think the average untrained ear gravitates to, is if you see enough performances of someone and they sound good in all of them, they're like, yeah, they're consistent. And I think that people do consider that a lot. Chen specifically, like, he's just got a really silky tone. Um, and I haven't done a video on them for a while. I should do another one, but Yeah, there's just nothing about them that seems dangerous vocally that I'm like, that's gonna cause a problem sometime. They seem really well trained. I wish I had more specifics, but that's kind of the problem when you start talking about really good singers is it's like, well, they're in balance. They're using enough airflow. They're not using too much. Their vocal folds are vibrating really well. Their vowels are well tuned. Um,
Yeah.
there's not too much to say. Like that's why I like working. I like doing videos on people that things go wrong because then there's actually something to talk about.
Right. It's kind of like no news is good news kind of thing, where it's like if everything's working, then.
Yeah. Why do you like EXO, or do you?
Oh, I do like EXO. Although a lot of people probably probably don't know about that because I don't really talk about most other K-pop groups aside from BTS typically.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's a lot of fan stuff associated with that because allegedly there's a rivalry and stuff like that. I don't really pay attention to that as much these days. But in terms of EXO, I mean, actually my girlfriend is very into EXO. One thing that I think is always noticeable about EXO is that they have this great range in terms of their vocal performance, especially in like R&B songs. They're really good at these songs that are a bit more, played down, kind of akin to like 90s R&B or 2000s R&B. And they hit these really nice riffs, and obviously the belting is on point and things like that. And like you said, there's just like a balance and a consistency where it's like you just almost it almost feels like you're in safe hands, like you're in a car and somebody's driving, and that that person is going to get you there as efficiently and consistently as possible.
Exactly. And I think that the average listener can hear that. And that's why when we hear people that things are going badly, people squirm in their seats and they cringe because people physically feel this stuff. Even if you're not if you don't know what you're feeling, people feel it and they feel whether it's going to be safe or not. And I think that it's fair for people to just start trusting that more. You don't need me as an authority to say if someone is good.
Right. Right. I mean, that when we sort of conclude, we'll kind of talk about that kind of aspect. But lastly, we can kind of go over BTS, who you went over recently because you reacted to their performance of Black Swan and James Corden.
Oh man, they're just so theatrical.
Yeah,
and in a way that I respond to a lot because growing up, I think the first band that I liked, the first music other than like Tarzan was NSYNC, and I was just like so into NSYNC, and they were so theatrical, and I see a lot of that with BTS, and I don't watch a ton of BTS on my own, but from what I've seen, they've been so consistent with how well prepared they've been.
Right. What's fascinating about BTS is that within these sort of K-pop communities, you get a lot of people that will kind of pass along this notion that they're not good singers, basically.
Sure.
People will compare them to other types of singers that are quite popular in K-pop and say, well, BTS, their technique isn't good, their technique isn't that good, it's average, and sort of comment about different things like range or like, sort of try to put things in an objective state where they say like, BTS is objectively just not as good as any of these other groups, and you can't argue with it, which is just so bizarre to me. But there are certain things that BTS do vocally that I think are quite outstanding. I mean, I'm saying that as a fan of the group. So there's not much. I guess you can discredit me in that way, but from seeing how you've responded to BTS, even aside from sort of the theatricality and the like technical like display of their performances, you also have been quite complimentary of the way that they use their instruments, whether it's in like a vocally demanding sense or even in a sense of like how they're moving their body versus how they're controlling their voice, which is one of the most difficult things to do in terms of like dancing and singing. So I would like for you to sort of talk about that and that kind of idea.
I think it's the same thing. It's like these people that are fairly unproblematic and understand their instruments, there's so little to talk about because it's like they're really consistent, and I'm never scared when I'm watching them that like it's not gonna work or that they're just yelling it out in a really uncontrolled kind of guesswork way.
Right.
And I think that a lot of that comes from, their management just recognizing who they have available and them not writing anything that would be risky.
Right.
But it's like there can be a lot of really good singers out there. And that's another thing that I think people forget, is that singing is not a zero-sum game. Like there can be infinite number of really, really spectacular, talented singers out there. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. Like I really just am not scared when they're singing. And I think it goes into the same idea I was talking about with their dancing and their theatrics, is if they're that well practiced with that stuff, they're really well practiced with their voices. They know what they can do. They trust their voices, and they don't really push outside of those lines.
Right.
So maybe that's why people are like, well, they're just objectively not as good. Well, I am never going to be an objectively great low bass. I know that that's who I am. Right. And I don't try to do that. And then people aren't like, yeah, well, Sam doesn't have the low end of Bon Iver, so he's bad. Like, it's just stupid. Right. But I think that a lot of people try to do that. And I don't get it, because, like, it sounds like a really unhappy way to live, always saying that these people are bad because they don't have the same range as your favorite singer. It's like, no, both can be good. You can just prefer one.
Yeah. Like everybody can have their strength or their particular quality that makes them, as.
And I think that it's like BTS is massively famous. They are doing so well. That's happening for a reason. People are responding to them for some reason, and it's not because they're bad and lucky.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wish I could print that somewhere and hand it to some people, because there's a lot of people who will sort of imply that. But I guess that happens a lot with a lot of great performers.
For sure.
Concluding, sort of the pull away is as we've spoken about just now, that idea of like each singer having their own quality and their own thing that they want to do, and their own thing that they feel capable of doing, and a matter of executing on that desire and on that goal, and that allowing for so many different types of singers to be immensely popular and to be immensely well liked and to be incredibly effective without all sounding the same and all having to sound the same in order to be considered good. And this kind of thing still exists a lot in sort of music culture and vocal culture, of even just ranking vocalists and things like that. And people on YouTube will be pointed at, and like there are these YouTube channels that pop up that will be like comparing this vocalist or ranking vocalists here and there, and then talking about like the supported note and things like that. And I was sort of wondering if you could speak to just like in conclusion, coming full circle, like how much opinion and fact can be separated when it comes to these conversations, and like where people need to improve in terms of how they perceive vocal performance and things like that.
I think that ultimately people really need to shift their focus to, do I like this or do I not like this? And why do I like this or why do I not like this? Rather than looking at the objective things that people might be doing as any measure of them liking it or not liking it. It's like, okay, I like Beyonce. Why do I like Beyonce? Beyonce makes me feel good when I listen to her. Like, ultimately, that's it. And I like to sing along with Beyonce, and it feels good to sing along with Beyonce. Then you can look at the objective things that she's doing well, either to become a better singer yourself or to understand why she's doing that, or to just because I think people really do like to understand why they like these things, but it's ultimately still that is, you have this gut instinct that you like a thing and that you're connecting to them. And I really would love for people to to start remembering why they like music in the first place. Because I guarantee you that if, like, an infant, a young person started hearing Mariah and they really connected to it, they wouldn't be like, oh, wow, I like Mariah because of her amazing high notes. Like, that's just not why people connect to things. And the more that we can talk about, are people communicating effectively, and what's the content of what they're trying to communicate, and how does it make us feel, then it can help us learn more about who we are as humans rather than always trying to compete with each other.
Yeah, I don't know about you, Sam. When I listen to a record, the first thing I'm thinking about is how resonant the C3 is. I just need to hear that vibrato.
Oh my
Sam,
gosh.
it's been excellent speaking to you about these artists, and thank you so much for lending your time to me today. I've had a lot of fun.
Thank you, Elliot.
Yeah. All right. Take care.
You too.